Um, so these are just 3 points to take away from what we need to do in this conversation. First of all, for investors listening, it's important for you to understand your importance in all this. I like to stress, it's finance, not physics, that actually commits us to future warming. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. For companies and investors, at present, I think most people would consider climate risk as primarily about a reputational risk. You know, companies and investors feeling that they need to be seen to be doing something about this, and what people often call policy risk. So companies hedging their investments against the future evolution of climate policy. I would argue that the risks are evolving beyond that into areas that investors may not be thinking about so much at the moment. And finally, I'll talk about what we need to do to evaluate whether companies that you might be investing in are on a credible pathway to net zero. So just on this first point, looking at what commits us to future warming. Well, we stressed in the opening webinar on this series the cumulative impact of carbon dioxide emissions on climate. So every ton of carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere causes has a permanent impact on global temperatures. It pushes up global temperatures, and temperatures stay up until we actively take that ton of carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is what we call a cumulative or stock pollutant, and its impact on climate is permanent. So the only way to stop carbon dioxide causing global warming is to stop dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's why we need to reach net zero. And this is well-established science. It was first became clear to me, some work I did with David Frame back in the mid-2000s, and a number of papers were published towards the end of that decade, which made this point, and that was taken up by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the 5th assessment cycle, and subsequently was acknowledged in the Paris Climate Agreement. So this is very well-established science now. So if we want to know what warming to expect in the future, we've only got to look at the emissions that are committed from plants that we already have today. And this is a very interesting, challenging figure from a paper by Alex Pfeiffer and co-authors here in the university that shows the committed emissions from electricity power plants alone built before 2017. So as you build new power plants, you add to committed emissions on the assumption that those power plants are run for their natural design lifetime, might be 30 or 40 years. And then if you were to stop building new power plants, then as you retire old power plants, your committed emissions decline. So that's what happens in this figure. You can see we've been building new power plants very rapidly over the past couple of decades. We've been driving up the total stock of committed emissions. If we were to stop building new fossil fuel power plants, if we had stopped building new fossil fuel power plants in 2017, then the total stock of committed emissions would have immediately started to decline and would have reached zero around 2050. And that would have been consistent with limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. So you could say, well, oh, that's good news. Sounds like we're not yet committed to driving global temperatures above 1.5 degrees. But if we look not just at electricity power plants that have been built, but also look at the ones that are, I should, by the way, as a matter of interest, this is where these power plants are in the world. So the bulk of these new plants that were built over the past decade have been in Asia. The OECD, or the countries that were in the OECD in 1990, those countries, actually you can see that the brown wedge is actually declining slightly. So those countries have actually been retiring power plants faster than they've been building them. And the rest of the world, REF, would be primarily, that's where Africa's emissions fit into this. And you can see that Africa's emissions have been on, committed emissions have been reasonably constant over the past decade, but that may well be changing in the future. What's crucially missing on those figures is plants that are under construction right now and are planned. These are the plants that are being funded by your investments, whether they are bonds or fixed income investments or direct equity in the companies that are building these plants. And you can see the gray area here is the same as the colored area in these graphs. You see it goes up to just over 300 and then declines again. Sorry. So here it is, going up to just over 300 and then declining again. But this light gray region, that's the emissions that are committed from plants that are under construction and planned at the moment. And as you can see, it pretty much doubles the area of future committed emissions if we also include the plants under construction and planned. And that would be enough to take us well over 1.5 degrees. So if we're to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to think about these plants that are under construction and planned. And this is an extremely relevant question today, because only yesterday, Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency you should look at an article in The Guardian yesterday where Fatih Birol was talking about the dangers of raised by post-COVID-19 recovery plans. If those recovery plans involve a major investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure that will, because it's, some countries may be so desperate just to restart their economies any way they can, if we build new coal-fired power plants today, then those power plants will, unless they're retired early, which of course is a very expensive option, they will be running for many decades to come and run the risk of of either driving global temperatures over 1.5 degrees and us failing to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, or needing to be retired early and become stranded assets in the transition to a post-carbon future. So that's the danger which investors face. And that's why it is that I say that it's finance, not physics, that drives future warming. The physics doesn't commit us to future warming. If we were able to switch our emissions off today, we wouldn't actually see very much future warming. But if it's the investments we've made and continuing to make in our energy infrastructure that commits us to future emissions that will drive global temperatures above the limits set by the Paris Climate Agreement. So the dark area here, just to summarize, is the remaining, as it were, share of the carbon budget that we should be allocating to electricity generation to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. You can see that it declines to 0 around 2050. So that would be, if we were to stop construction now, that would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. But if we build all these plants that are planned and under construction, then that would not be consistent with 1.5 degrees. So that's the big decision that has to be made. In thinking about this decision, in thinking about financing these plants, banks and investors have to think about the risks they're taking in doing so. And obviously, there's the obvious risk to the future of the planet. But of course, the future of the planet is not really reflected on your risk register as investors and as lenders. But other risks are starting to emerge. Most companies are very well aware of the reputational risk of investing in the fossil fuel sector. They're also aware of the policy risk, that's the risk of climate policy evolving in such a direction that a power plant that looks like a good investment today may no longer look like such a good investment in 10 years' time if carbon prices rise and the power that it generates is no longer economic. But there are other risks as well that you might not think about, not thought about. Here are some pictures from an event that traumatized the fossil fuel industry almost 10 years ago. This is the Macondo oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon disaster, in which BP, tragically, several people lost their lives in the explosion, and BP ended up with one of the worst oil leaks in history into the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, which caused untold damage to the for example, the shrimp fisheries in that region, and landed BP with a horrendous liability for cleanup. So the point being, there was absolutely no question at that time that BP were liable for the vast bulk of the costs of that disaster. But interestingly, if a fossil fuel company sells a product or is responsible for releasing fossil carbon into the atmosphere, they're not really responsible at all. If you put CO2, if you put fossil carbon onto the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, you're liable to the consequences. If you put fossil carbon into our global atmosphere, you're not liable. But increasingly, the question is being raised, why not? Because it's becoming clearer that as the world warms, the risk of extreme weather events like Australian wildfires, one of those pictures there, or sea level rise and the loss of sea ice affecting villages in the Arctic, that's the other picture you're seeing here. The question is being raised, why are the companies that are selling the products that's causing this harm or increasing the risk of this harm, why are they not being held liable for the consequences? And I think this question is going to continue to be raised and will increasingly represent a risk, maybe not a very likely risk, but a very substantial risk if it was to actually materialize to companies that are heavily invested in the fossil fuel sector. Because the attractiveness of your fossil fuel investments would look very different, I can assure you, if you also included the liabilities associated with the emissions, caused by the plants you're invested in. So very happy to come back to that point. It's a sort of technical point and not one that people investing in the fossil fuel industry are often thinking about, but it's one I wanted to draw your attention to because I think it's the kind of black swan risk that investors need to have in mind if they're going to be evaluating these investments appropriately. Finally, we just want to talk about how can you invest today with the need for net zero acknowledged. Many investors have acknowledged the need for net zero. So how can you turn that acknowledgement of the need for net zero into a practical investment strategy today? So one of the ideas that we need to be cautious about is just comparing business models to individual scenarios. I know that we'll probably talk more about this in the course of this session, but this is an example that I often quote of what is, in my view, bad practice. This is from ExxonMobil's Energy and Carbon Summary from 2018. And they make the point in this one, well, our plans are consistent with our 2018 outlook for energy. That's the red line there. And that 2018 outlook for energy is not too far away from these assessed 2-degree scenarios, the blue plume there. So Exxon felt they were done. They didn't really need to explain anything further. The difficulty, of course, here is that they stop talking about their outlook in this report as soon as it gets interesting. So they're saying that they've got an outlook for energy going to 2040, and then they just have nothing to say about what happens after that. And yet ExxonMobil, along with every other oil major, is investing in identifying new fossil fuel reserves and developing infrastructure for fossil fuel extraction in fields that they plan will still be productive in 30, 40, 50 years' time. These companies invest on very long timescales. So by ending the conversation in 2040, just at the moment where it starts to get interesting from a climate perspective, I think is what we need to avoid doing. What we need is for companies to actually tell us not what their plans are for the next decade or decade and a half or so, but actually what they're going to look like in a net zero world. Even if that's a little bit further away, that's much more relevant information to investors assessing whether companies really have taken the net zero challenge seriously than whether or not their short-term plans are consistent with a particular scenario. And that was the heart of the Oxford Martin Principles for Climate Conscious Investment, which you can find on the Oxford Martin School website. And they boil down to 3 simple questions that we believe investors should be asking the companies they invest in. First of all, have you made a commitment to net zero emissions at all? Has the company even acknowledged the need to get to net zero? And it's, we could perhaps go beyond that to say, okay, if you have made a commitment to net zero, when are you going to make sure that your company is consistent with net zero? You might set a date like 2050 or something, or you might set a global temperature. I mean, as a physicist, I would prefer companies to set a global temperature goal because that's what we're really focused on. I'd like a company to be saying, no matter what happens in the future, we will be net zero by the time global temperatures reach 1.5 degrees. But generally, companies prefer dates because they're sort of easier for them to get their minds around. As well as a commitment to net zero, companies also have to explain what they're going to look like in a net zero world. Do they still have a profitable net zero business model? And this is where I think the conversations with investors can be a little bit more searching, because many companies, 3 of the major oil and gas companies have now come out with net zero commitments. BP, Shell, and Total have all committed in some form to achieve net zero for at least some of the emissions associated with their activities by 2050. But what they've been much less clear about, and I think this is fair, you're welcome to join in the discussion on this, they've been much less clear about how that's going to be financed and who's going to pay for it. So I think what we don't want is for companies to, as it were, bank on a carbon bailout and bank on the idea that they will be continuing to sell products that result in emissions and expect someone else to clean up after them. So that's where I think more searching questions need to be asked about whether companies really have factored in the cost of achieving net zero completely into their long-term business plans. And finally, of course, investors should be demanding quantitative medium-term targets on much shorter timescales so as to be able to monitor whether these are just words the company's making their commitments today, or whether they're actually translating it into practice. In particular, are the long-term investments of companies consistent with their net zero plans? Are they investing, for example, in carbon dioxide disposal at the same rate that they're investing in bringing new carbon sources on stream by identifying new fossil fuel reserves? It's that balance that's going to determine whether we achieve net zero or not. And it's that balance that I think investors need to be asking companies searching questions about at the moment, if they're going to make sure that these companies are going to be effective stewards of those investors' capital as we make the transition to a net zero world. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Miles. It's a very comprehensive presentation where you've told us exactly what companies need to do, you know, some of the plans, why banks should not be financing coal and oil and gas plants and all of that. One thing before we go on to Matt is that, Miles, you know, South Africa relies on coal quite a bit. And for example, also Ghana has some oil reserves, and, you know, these countries want to be able to rely on these fossil fuels and all. What do you think about it? Because currently, for example, South Africa, you know, the economy relies on coal quite a bit. And, so, you know, yeah, you get what I'm saying, yes.
Yeah, so if I might just respond directly to that, I did not say, just to be clear, I did not say that that no one should be investing in the fossil fuel industry. What I did say is that if we are to continue to invest in the fossil fuel industry, we need to be asking these big questions about the companies we're investing in. So if South Africa or Ghana is continuing to build fossil infrastructure, what is the plan for what's going to happen to that carbon dioxide that infrastructure is going to generate? Do the companies who are building those power plants or developing Ghana's offshore gas reserves, do they have a plan for achieving net zero? What does that plan look like? Who's going to pay for it? It's possible to use fossil fuels without dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But if we're going to do that by mid-century, we need to be investing now in making that possible. So we need if we're going to make sure that these investments are not at risk of being stranded by the transition to a net zero world, then we need to be making sure that companies are thinking ahead and planning for that net zero future. The worst possible outcome, of course, would be for Ghana and South Africa to invest a lot of money now, to take on a lot of debt, to build a lot of fossil fuel-based energy infrastructure, and then to discover in 2040 that they have to retire it early because the world is no longer prepared to tolerate the levels of warming that we're starting to see by then. So, you know, that's the danger that we're facing. And that's why I think this is a good time to be having this conversation.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I see that questions are coming through the chats. Please, can you put it through the Q&A button? It's easier for the panelists to also see it through the Q&A button. Thank you very much, Miles. We'll come back to you. Right now, we're going to Matthew Phillips, who is from the UN and is going to talk to us about the Climate Ambition Alliance, what it is about. So thank you very much. I leave the virtual floor to you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you very much for having me today, and also wonderful to hear Miles's presentation, and would love to connect on that separately. So just to introduce myself, as Rachel mentioned, I work at United Nations Climate Change, also known as United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a rather brutal acronym there. What I've been involved in is coordinating a campaign which is called the Climate Ambition Alliance, which I will explain more about in just a moment. And more specifically, I've been coordinating how we bring non-party stakeholders into this campaign. And I should say that this is an umbrella net zero campaign. And it is led by the two climate action champions, Gonzalo Munoz for Chile and Nigel Topping for the UK. So what I'd like to do with you now is, if I may, share a presentation with you so you can see what the Climate Ambition Alliance is, and also what kind of the intersections are with the campaign that we have just launched, in fact, called Race to Zero. So I trust you can all now see my screen, and you can see the kind of new framing here. So let me start with a bit of history, and I'll take you back in time for those who might not be familiar with the kind of literature and the history of this. We launched the Climate Ambition Alliance in September last year at the United Nations Secretary General's Climate Action Summit. This was launched by Chile, and it was all to really sell and demonstrate a positive story on ambition. And the idea was to bring all actors together. And by all actors, I mean not just countries, but also the actors that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here. So cities, regions, businesses, investors, to really show that all actors were united behind the ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement, and hopefully that 1.5 degree goal. We launched at that time in September in New York with essentially a really good kind of starting point. We had about 500 businesses, we had 20 investors, we had 15 or so regions and 10 investors, and about 60 countries. And it wasn't a bad start at all. We then grew that through the next 3 months into COP25 in Madrid, which is when obviously the UN process had its next climate negotiations. And we grew that figure upwards exponentially, so that those same actors now encompassed 18% of CO2 emissions coverage on net zero, and 33% of global GDP coverage, which again was a very positive story to sell an ambition. So that's how we closed 2019 in terms of the Climate Ambition Alliance. And I should say that now obviously there is an ambition that we pass the baton from Chile to the UK, who is obviously leading on the next climate negotiations, so that they can also further kind of mobilize this alliance towards the negotiations that will happen in Glasgow next year, obviously due to the postponement. There are a few things that happened when we went into this year with this alliance. We realized more than ever before that we needed to really reactivate this alliance in a far bigger way than we had in 2019, to again show that all actors were committing to net zero. Secondly, we needed to do that in a credible way, and I will go on to that in a moment, but we needed to kind of build a good criteria so that it didn't look like we were simply greenwashing with all of these net zero targets. And the final thing to mention is, obviously we came into 2020 without knowing that we were about to plunge into this global pandemic, this crisis that we are all now suffering from in multifarious ways. So I think the challenge for us now is to obviously reactivate this Climate Ambition Alliance, really make it more credible than it ever was before, but also show net zero as being a pathway to emerge from the pandemic actually in a better place than we started it. Obviously, we have two routes with the stimulus packages that are being announced that we can go down. And we hope very much that by showing that all actors are really mobilizing behind net zero, they'll choose that green, resilient recovery. So that's what this is about. So what I'm now going to do is pivot into what Race to Zero is and how this fits in with the Climate Ambition Alliance that Rachel has kindly invited me to speak to you about today. So the Race to Zero is a new campaign that was launched on the 5th of June, so a couple of Fridays ago. And it was launched by the two climate champions that I just mentioned, Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munoz. And the role of this campaign is to basically mobilize these non-party stakeholders, so these non-governmental actors, into the Climate Ambition Alliance to really kind of show that these actors are wanting to emerge from the pandemic with these net zero pathways still intact, and actually probably double down on their commitments even further. Why is it a race? It's a race because we wanted it to reflect the urgency of the action required and not have this campaign be perceived in a way that we were kicking the can down the road and allowing actors simply to make a 2050 commitment when actually we need them to start moving in on that target in a way that, in fact, Miles has been describing far sooner than that. So this is the kind of history, and I should say that I put it in the context of obviously COVID-19, but the other important context to bear in mind here is the fact that we want to spur national climate ambition. So governments, as you know, are required under the Paris Agreement to hopefully ratchet up the ambition of their national climate commitments called nationally determined contributions. And we're really hoping that this alliance, and with all of these actors indicating leadership around net zero, will help give governments that confidence to really come back to the table in Glasgow with renewed plans. And I should say actually that although Glasgow is going to be next year, the plans, the national ones that they are required to submit, are still very much due for this year. So the pressure is on, the race is on. So let me just dive a little bit in terms of who's in the race to zero and what it currently represents. We, as I say, launched this on the 5th of June. We launched it with the COP26 president, Alok Sharma, with the 2 climate champions who I've mentioned, and also some real massive non-party stakeholder leaders who were pledging to go in net zero, as well as Mark Carney. And I'll kind of go into that in more detail ever. It's important to realize and reflect on the fact that even in this time of COVID, on the 5th of June, we managed to assemble the largest ever alliance on net zero. And it has the coverage that you can see before you now. 53% global GDP coverage, 23 global CO2 emissions, and 1/3 of the global population. So this is an extraordinary baseline and represents obviously a very much an upward trajectory and commitment and ambition around net zero that has really grown since September last year when we first launched this thing. So incredibly positive signals that we're seeing here. And I think one of the things that we'd like to do from a strategic communications perspective is really ensure that this club is so irresistible around net zero that it manifests itself as FOMO, fear of missing out, for all of the actors that aren't in it, so that by the time we get to Glasgow, we really have this this snowball momentum that's generated around race to zero. I will probably share these slides after the presentation so that you can actually see all of the members who signed up, but I'll just reflect on the launch a bit to say that we had obviously Mark Carney at the launch, and I just want to reflect on one of the things he said because it's relevant to the presentation that Miles just shared with us, because he's really talking about the commitment that we want to see from the investor community. And he said, the transition to net zero is creating the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. Net zero targets must be underpinned by transition plans so that investors can assess which companies will seize the opportunities and which companies will not. So I think there's huge momentum and energy behind that. And it's important to say that we had major companies on the day committing to net zero. One of them was Rolls-Royce, and we had the CEO, Warren Davis, committing to a 1.5 aligned target. And I think this is an extraordinary thing to see, because obviously companies like Rolls-Royce have been on the front lines of the COVID crisis. They've announced, in their case, 9,000 job cuts, and yet they are still coming up with these commitments because they know that they need to emerge from this crisis on this trajectory. So it's kind of incredible and kind of encouraging to kind of see this leadership still being represented there. I just want to touch on a few missing pieces and also touch on the ambition for what now in terms of the race to zero. And I should say that what we want to do is really see a 10-fold increase in terms of the numbers that are signing up to this race. And we want to ensure that we're really representing all parts of society in all sectors. And one of the missing areas that I'd like to pinpoint, because it's relevant for the present discussion, is the investor community, and more specifically, more broadly, the finance community. So we already have some leading asset owners that I will talk about in a moment, but we don't have all of the banks, all of the insurers, and it would be, I think, one thing that we'll be looking to do through Mark Carney and through other efforts that are going on through the investor community is really to understand how they can more broadly align with net zero, and we can get them credibly into the race. The other missing area that I'd like to comment on is we want to ensure that we have more global regional diversity. I say that there is a global north bias in the actors that are currently signed up to this race, and we definitely want to make sure that it is more broadly representative moving forwards. So let me now go into what makes up Race to Zero and what goes into it, because obviously it's an umbrella campaign that is essentially working with some phenomenal initiatives that many of you will be very familiar with. So these are the initiatives that you can see on the screen in front of you that are currently the Race to Zero partners. And these are credible net zero kind of initiatives that we've selected and handpicked and worked with over the course of the last year and a half or so, that are mobilizing these commitments directly from the specific actor groups that we've been focusing up until this point. So that's the businesses, the investors, the cities and the regions. And I think moving forward, what we'd like to do is to bring in even more networks. We'd like to bring in schools, we'd like to bring in media organizations, sports clubs. We'd like to have a way to bring in millions of SMEs who would like to kind of get into the Race to Zero. So there's a lot of opportunities that we'd like to do now that we've launched. But I should just go back to saying we can only bring on these actors if we do so in a credible way. Otherwise, all of the robustness around this alliance and what it means, and obviously the moment that we'd like it to create towards Glasgow, will be called into question. So with that in mind, we started to work very closely with Oxford, in fact, and with Miles's team and other colleagues there to start trying to get to convergence around what the hell net zero even means. It's very complex when you're dealing with a campaign like Race to Zero, which has many different types of actors. So we're comparing cities with investors and investors with companies. And obviously there are interlinkages there, but these are vastly challenging and complicated issues, and you can't compare like for like here. Nonetheless, we thought it was important at the political and the global level to reach a kind of collective understanding around what net zero leadership looks like. So over the past 3 months, Oxford have been convening a series of net zero discussions to really reach this convergence that I described. And again, on the slide in front of you, you can see links to the minimum criteria and also the broader mapping documents that Oxford has done with all of the partners that you saw on the previous page. Essentially, the criteria boils down to the 4 Ps, as I'm going to describe them: pledge, plan, proceed, and publish. And I'm sure these won't come as any surprise to you. Obviously, make a pledge, 2040s or sooner. Obviously, this is a race, and we're trying to build up that competitive spirit. Secondly, plan. And what we're saying to actors that want to join Race to Zero is that they need to submit a plan by COP26 if they want to be in the gang, so to speak. Thirdly, proceed, i.e. take immediate actions. As we've mentioned, it's not just about 2050, we need them to set immediate interim targets. And again, that will shore up the credibility of this whole thing. And then finally, publish. And this means obviously just reporting back on their progress towards meeting that longer term target. And we needed to build in an accountability mechanism to this whole piece. So hopefully that makes broad sense. I'd be happy to ask more questions. It's important to say that we haven't completely nailed all of the issues around net zero. This is going to be an ongoing conversation. Obviously, there are some contentious issues here around offsetting, around scopes, and so on and so forth. So this discussion is not over, and I think it will be a very rich one that will continue over the coming months with this community. But at least we've started that, and we've started that process around convergence. So just finally, I just want to just pause in terms of what the Race to Zero is trying to do now. And I've obviously said we need to tenfold the number of actors and really ensure that we have a sense that all actors from different constituency groups are coming into the race, are committing to net zero, and once more are doing it in a credible way. We obviously have these trusted partners that meet the criteria that I've just shown you. But I should say at the top of this slide, we're looking for more networks that we feel can meet the minimum criteria, that would go through a kind of peer review process to ensure that they can come in to the race. And we want to make sure, obviously, that when we take on board these new initiatives and coalitions, that they are touching upon some of these missing areas that I described, so that we're more squarely bringing in this global diversity, we're more squarely bringing in the finance community, and that's just a couple of the missing areas, but there are more. So I do hope that anyway, by the time we get to Glasgow, and we've now got an 18-month run-in that we really have all participants joining this inclusive race and qualifying for it. So I'll pause there. Hopefully that sparks some questions, but thank you for listening to the overview, and I'll hand over back to you, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Matt, for such a comprehensive presentation again. I know that most people didn't know much about the Climate Ambition Alliance, but today we've all learned quite a lot about it, what it's really about, and the fact that, you know, different agents, if I can say, are all participating. If you look at businesses, countries, and all of that. Now, for example, if there are have you had any organizations, firstly, have you had any organizations from Africa sort of signing up to be part of this Net Zero Alliance? And if not, what are you doing about it to help encourage organizations from Africa to join?
It's a very good question. In fact, so we have had some fantastic organizations signing up from Africa. Most extraordinarily, we had Freetown, obviously the capital of Sierra Leone, that signed up on the 5th of June for the launch and has joined C40 cities. So there has been progress there. I would say that the tools and the partners that we have currently assembled probably again they're based in the global north. Something I'd be interested in pursuing is whether we can actually have more exposure to the right networks and coalitions within the African continent, so that we can encourage them to actually work with those actors directly that we're not currently seeing yet. So I'd say that of the bigger companies in Africa and of the bigger capital cities, we are getting some traction there, and that's encouraging to see, but we're not getting the range that I'd like to.
Fantastic. So how can we help? I mean, for those who are watching now as well, I'd like you to learn more about this and will be following you. How can they help? Where can they get more information?
So what I would say is they can obviously reach out to myself. We're actually we're setting up, right, because we've only just launched on the 5th of June, we're now putting in place a process where we can work with regionally based actors and networks to guide them through what the criteria means and how they can guide their own actors to meet that criteria. So what I would suggest in the first instance, is reach out to me directly, and then obviously we will connect you to the groups that we are setting up that will guide them on this journey. But at the moment, what we need is we need that broader network in order to invite this increased participation.
Fantastic, fantastic. And I'm quite happy to also hear that you're working with quite a lot of organizations and sort of consolidating all the work that is being done as well. So thank you. Miles, before we go into Q&A, I just want to have your views on the Climate Ambition Alliance as well. What do you think about it? You're on mute, yeah.
Yes, no, I think it's obviously it's a fantastic initiative, and it's great to see the level of enthusiasm and engagement with this issue. But as Matthew pointed out, we all of us have quite a lot of work to do in terms of making clarifying even what net zero means, and that's, you know, actually from a just to reassure you, from a scientific perspective, we know what it'll take to stop global warming. So it's not a scientific debate really here, but translating what we know about the physics of global warming into the appropriate responsibilities for different kinds of companies is a conversation we should be having now. So it was already raised in the Q&A, companies' responsibilities for Scope 3 emissions. I think this is, so just in case there's anybody who's not already a investing in fossil fuel industry nerd on the call, so Scope 3 emissions, apologies for those who know this already, Scope 3 emissions are the emissions associated with the use of the products a company sells, rather than emissions generated by the company's activities themselves. So for an extractive fossil fuel company, their Scope 3 emissions may be 85% of the total. And so that's the carbon dioxide generated when we, the customers, burn the products that company sells. So there is a question to be discussed. what is a company's responsibility for their scope 3 emissions? Traditionally, in the UNFCCC, Matthew might like to comment on this, that's always been regarded as somebody else's responsibility, that, you know, we assign responsibility for emissions at the point the CO2 is generated, not at the point the carbon comes out of the ground. But actually, for consumers, particularly consumers in developing countries, it's perhaps not reasonable to expect them to take responsibility for their emissions, and it's perhaps more reasonable to say the responsibility might be moved upstream, so to speak, and assigned to the company that's selling the product whose use results in those emissions. And I think that's a conversation that investors need to be having with the companies they invest in. Are those companies taking responsibility for these scope 3 emissions? And some of the big fossil fuel companies are starting to talk about this. In BP's latest BP Net Zero strategy, they explicitly do take responsibility for the carbon dioxide generated by some of the products they sell. It's not all of them. It's an interesting distinction that they make. So Shell, for example, is also offering its customers a service to compensate for the carbon generated by the products they sell, but also being very careful. If you look at the Shell website on this, they're also very careful to say, but we, Shell, are not responsible for the emissions generated by the products that we sell. So there's clearly a lively conversation going on about responsibility here, and that's exactly what investors need to get engaged with.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Matt, as well. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're now joining us, welcome to this webinar where on the Oxford Martin Principles and the Climate Ambition Alliance. We started off with Professor Myles Allen, who spoke extensively about committed emissions from existing infrastructure and how they jeopardize the 1.5 degree. He also spoke about, the Oxford Martin principles and spoke briefly about what it's really about and how it can be achieved. Matthew Phillips also spoke to us about what the climate ambition really is, the organizations that they're working with, what they plan to do, and also how organizations can sort of sign up to take part in this, and when it was actually kicked off, which was in June. I urge you to continue to stay on. I see the questions are coming through the Q&A. Please keep submitting any questions. If you're emailing me at this moment as well, just know that I can't look at my emails. Can you please send your questions through the Q&A box? So thank you very much for joining us, and we're continuing with this webinar. Now, Professor Myles, I have a lot of questions where people also want to drill in deeper into the Oxford Martin principles, right? You did mention about it. Now, they want to understand how can it be applied. You've touched on it broadly here and there, talking right now even about, scope 3 emissions, what you need to be asking, what needs to be done. But if we can just take this from the top and say, what are the right questions to be asking? The Martin principle talks about medium-term targets being set, and it talks about medium-term targets being set, disclosure of absolute emissions and carbon emission intensity. Can you just break it down for us? Because today our audience is quite wide. Apart from the financial service industry, we also have investors and all of that are watching. They want to understand how can they apply these principles? What questions can they really, really ask? So we're into the how. So please can you elaborate for us?
Sure. So the crucial point is to keep it simple. There are some very simple questions that can be asked that will reveal a lot about companies' long-term investment plans and how ready they are for the post-carbon transition. Obviously, the first question is, have they even made a commitment at all? I mean, that's relatively straightforward. And most companies are very happy to say, yeah, sure, we'll be net zero by 2050 or whatever. I mean, so That's sort of moving quite rapidly, and increasing numbers of companies are feeling it's just not, it's just not worth arguing about it. They're just sort of joining in. But then the next question is the really important one. And this is where investors need to take responsibility for evaluating companies themselves, because that's your job as investors, and not expect a sort of a tick boxing exercise to do this for you. So, because whether a company is actually ready for net zero is an assessment you need to make of that company itself. It depends on the business it's in. A telecoms company could probably very easily transition to net zero by simply saying, okay, we'll get our power from a renewable supplier rather than getting it from a fossil fuel supplier. They have to show how they've got a plan to switch their energy suppliers, and they're probably mostly done. Now, a mining company or a fossil fuel company or a company that's heavily involved in building high carbon infrastructure, they've got a much more challenging task to produce a net zero plan. And the Oxford-Martin principles, we recognized, well, part of the motivation of this was we recognized that the best people to come up with a plan are the company directors themselves. They're the ones who know their business. And the best people to evaluate that plan are the investors themselves. They're the ones who have the incentives to make that evaluation stick. So we did not prescribe what companies should do, but we did say that companies need to produce a costed net zero plan. What is their business model in a net zero world? If they're still selling fossil fuels, for example, what is going to happen to the carbon dioxide generated by the use of those fossil fuels? Are they going to dispose of it themselves? That is partly what BP is offering to do, for example, and Shell. Or are they expecting someone else to dispose of it? And if they're expecting someone else to dispose of that CO2, how is it going to get paid for? Where is that reflected in the company's books? And where is that commitment reflected in the company's investments? If the company's planning to dispose of large amounts of CO2 by mid-century, where are they making the investments that will be required to make sure they have the capacity to do so? So these are the questions investors need to ask. The point of the Oxford-Martin principles was, somebody comments on, there's lots of these principles out there. Well, actually, when we looked at the sort of market for these things, there was a lot of quite complicated, like questionnaires that companies could fill in to get an ESG score out and so on. But a lot of these seem to us at least, to be missing the main point. And this was the point of the Oxford-Martin principles, to say, look, you can ask whatever you like about company management, ESG governance, and so forth, but you've got to ask the question, are you ready for net zero? And it's the answer to that question investors need to engage with in deciding if companies really are looking after their money through this transition.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Thank you, Miles. One more thing I also want to ask you here is, there's been a lot of socially responsible investors, that have been using shareholder resolutions to sort of force public traded companies to sort of plan for climate change. And they've received a lot of backlash here in South Africa and globally. What is your view on that? Is that strategy really working? What is the way forward?
I think it's really important for those behind these resolutions to emphasize that they are doing investors a favor by raising these issues. The worst possible outcome is for investors to make to put their money into assets that simply won't be fit for purpose for the second half of this century, because then it's worse for the planet and it's worse for the investors. So I think that's where perhaps these shareholder activists who are doing a great job of raising these issues, perhaps they could do a better job of explaining to everybody it's not just for the sake of the planet, it's also for the sake of the companies and the investors themselves. And this is why, you know, in the Oxford Martin Principles, we really focused on asking companies, what are your plans? You tell us what your plans are. We don't tell them what they should do. We're simply saying, you tell us what you're going to do to achieve net zero, and then your shareholders and your other stakeholders, your workforce and so forth, can have a conversation about whether that's going to be enough and whether it's going to be effective. For example, you know, just to bring it completely home, the University of Oxford we had a very intense debate about whether we should remain invested in the fossil fuel industry, and you can see it's all we just recently passed a motion which is all on the university's websites, where we've decided we are going to remain invested in the fossil fuel industry. We accept that we as a global university depend on the products that are sold by the fossil fuel industry, but we are going to engage intensely with the companies we remain invested in to evaluate their next net zero strategies. And we are committed to divest from any company that we feel going forward does not have a credible plan for achieving net zero and a credible plan for remaining profitable in a net zero world. So, you know, that's an example of the kind of thing that investors can do. And generally speaking, the response of the companies we're invested in so far has been guardedly positive to that position. They actually, these companies accept that this sort of scrutiny can actually be quite helpful for them.
Miles, this is fantastic because you've raised very, very good points, especially you know, the one about University of Oxford and, you know, not completely divesting from fossil fuels, but also just giving the companies to demonstrate what plans they have. I think a lot of people sort of misunderstand that concept and are not able to ask the right questions when they engage with these companies. And it's important to be able to ask the right questions and say, for example, you know, we need companies to just give us a credible plan, one that is really verifiable. Now, on that aspect as well, what does a credible plan really look like? If I may ask you that, what you know, many companies are greenwashing and they're coming up with targets and all of that. But what is really, you know, a credible plan, and how can a lay person who's also maybe not an investor read a company's financial statements and call them out on some of the statements?
Well, I think I'd probably want to hear from Matthew on this one as well, but my immediate reaction is it depends on the company. You know, yes. a telecoms company, which is why, you know, in the Oxford Martin School, we felt that these sort of universal ESG questionnaires applied to all companies didn't really work. Actually, you need, it's actually relatively few companies whose investments are really going to determine emissions in the second half of this century. If you think about, you know, which companies today are making the investments that will determine what we're emitting from 2050 onwards. And, you know, you don't need to be a specialist to work out which those companies are. And those are the companies whose shareholders and whose lenders need to be talking very seriously to them about, you know, what's going to happen to all this carbon dioxide that's generated by the products you sell. So that's, you know, it's in some ways it's sort of slightly dodging the question. So, well, it depends on the company, but it has to, because it depends on the business the company's in and what the company's plans are for making that business consistent with net zero. The really important point is, I think we need to, and this, I think Matthew mentioned this, we need companies to be much clearer about how their business as a self-contained entity is going to be consistent with net zero. I think we've got too many companies at the moment saying, sure, we'll be consistent with net zero, we'll just go and buy some forests somewhere and that'll mop up our carbon. And, you know, that's okay until you discover that all of the companies are committing to buy the same forest. And so I think investors need to ask much more searching questions about how this is actually going to work. And I think companies relying on, I think we need to accept that certainly by 2050, I don't think companies can rely on an external offset market to continue to be available and affordable as a means of them delivering their net zero goals. I think they're going to have to do it themselves, and they're going to have to explain to their investors how they're going to do it themselves.
Fantastic. Matt?
Hi, yes. I mean, you know, Miles, I think, summarized it very well in that obviously different kinds of entities, it's going to be appropriate for them to submit different kinds of plans. I think the best in class at the moment around the submission of those types of plans is probably the Science Based Targets Initiative and others, but just to kind of flag that. But I should be very clear that the kinds of plans that the Science Based Target Initiative is working with companies on are immense. I mean, we're talking hundreds of pages, and they're not going to be appropriate for all types of businesses. So I should be very clear that what we're going to be doing later in the year, and I think starting in September, is actually launching a platform for what I describe as the small medium enterprises, because it is not, I think, convenient or even appropriate for them to fill out one of these SBTI questionnaires. So what we're looking to do is actually develop tools for much smaller businesses that are in a different situation, for much different types of businesses that will be applicable to the sector they're in, to the size that they are, that can nonetheless give them a credible means of engaging in this process. And the other thing that I'll just add into this mix is, I think it's important that we make sure that this monitoring is captured very publicly on a kind of global platform. So we have under the kind of United Nations climate change, a portal called the Global Climate Action Portal. There are other instruments available, but basically we need a place which governments can see where they know that non-state actors, so businesses, investors, all the kind of entities we've described, are reporting back regularly on their progress, and they're actually not afraid to kind of submit that into this kind of UN system, which is basically stewarding the whole Paris Agreement process. So just to summarize, yes, hopefully we'll be developing some tools later in the year that I think will help different types of companies to do this in a credible way. And moreover, I really hope that we can kind of have an accountability system at the global level, which is really tracking all of these net zero commitments over the long term.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's look at questions from some of the audience as well. Miles, I see you responding to some, but there's one from Alice. It's a very long one, so I'm going to try and read it. I don't know if you've seen it. Alice is asking, how might you reply to a company like BHP, etc., who might accept responsibility or liability for their own emissions, Scope 1 and even Scope 2, but deny responsibility for emissions that arise from their customers' use of fossil fuels, Scope 3? Do you think these companies should be held responsible or liable for emissions that arise from the use of their products? If so, should they alone be held responsible? Thank you.
I think I'm going to leave Miles to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of should they, that sort of normative question is, I think I can dodge to some extent, because I can say that's going to depend on what we decide collectively, what the courts decide, what the public decides over the next 20 years or so. I have my own view, but that's not really perhaps the most important question for investors. One question is there a risk of them being held liable for the consequences of the emissions generated by the products they sell? And I think that risk in many jurisdictions is increasingly real. It may not, I'm sure it won't be everywhere in the world, but increasingly the issue is being raised because the impacts of climate change are overwhelmingly being felt by people and in countries that are not primarily responsible for the emissions that are causing it. That it's, the whole loss and damage conversation is getting more and more traction in the UNFCCC process. and even the question of individual liability for companies is starting to surface. So that's a sort of a black swan, what investors call these black swan events or something. It's a sort of it's a low probability but high impact risk of that liability emerging. Much more practical question is, what's the company's, which does relate to company scope 3 emissions. I think a company needs to explain its net zero business model, not just exactly the sort of accounting exercise of how it's going to achieve net zero in some definition of its own emissions. So if a company is sort of and has achieved a sort of accounting net zero in its own emissions, but its business model entirely depends on other people generating carbon dioxide, then I would say that's not a net zero. That is, I wouldn't just be what I would say, that is true. That is not a net zero compliant business model. A net zero compliant business model is consistent with net zero emissions along the entire supply chain, both from the company's suppliers and the company's products. So that's what investors need to be asking. What's your net zero business model? Are you going to be profitable in a world of net zero? Are you still going to be able to sell your products in that world? And that, you know, automatically brings these questions about scope 3 emissions into focus. So it's less a matter of liability and more a matter of credibility. You know, it's not credible for a company to claim to be net zero if they're still selling products that automatically, inevitably result in emissions through their use.
Thank you. Thank you, Miles. Now for Matt as well, I just got a question. Let me just scroll here a little bit. What are some of the best practices? Someone would just like to ask you, what are, I don't know what best practice, but maybe let me take another one. How acceptable will science-based targets be globally for both you and Miles? How acceptable will science-based targets be globally?
Sure. I mean, I can see some of the questions, and they're probably like to some extent more or less one and the same. In that,
yes.
I said that an example of best practice as far as the UNFCCC is concerned is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Obviously, we want people that are not only setting a science-based target, but hopefully going a little bit further and making sure that target is in line with net zero by 2050 and indeed with 1.5, which obviously distinct things. But that would be the best sign of leadership for us. And we're seeing many companies and indeed now cities also kind of meeting and matching those targets. So that's our kind of North Star in terms of net zero. But I should be very clear that it's not covering all bases. And this is why we're trying to use that best in class example and actually work out how we can kind of engage actors more broadly. And just if I can segue very quickly, Rachel, into another point, because I made the point during my presentation, but we're not getting regional coverage. So that best in class kind of way to engage is clearly not having the application regionally that we need. And there was a question raised in the Q&A, which was how many actors in India have signed up to Race to Zero and the Climate Ambition Line. So I did a quick scan whilst Miles was answering, sorry, Miles. And I can see that there are only 11 businesses and cities in India that have signed up to Race to Zero that have a science-based target. And then I did a quick scan for the UK, and I could see that 136 businesses and cities in the UK have signed up to Race to Zero. Now that's a huge imbalance, and it's obvious that we need way more traction and resonance there. So how can we get this kind of leadership around science-based targets and actually on the desks of CEOs and mayors across the subcontinent? So this is the question and an engagement that I would be very excited to have moving forwards.
Fantastic. Miles?
Yeah, well, just to stress that, I mean, India's position is clearly very different from the UK's. And that's why I think we really need to be emphasizing to everybody in this conversation how having a science-based target, having a net zero strategy is just good business sense in the world we live in. And it's, you know, there's a lot of conversations going on about responsibility and the need for rich countries to act first. And, you know, obviously the UK has a responsibility to act first because we started this. But, you know, that said, you know, particularly in countries like South Africa and India, people need to see this as just a precautionary measure for investors to take to make sure that their investments are proofed against net zero, because that is the direction the world is moving in. We won't stop global warming until we achieve net zero emissions. So whether we achieve net zero by 2050 or not, you know, we don't know what the outcome is, but I can tell you with certainty, we will achieve net zero one day because we cannot warm the planet indefinitely. We won't survive.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark. Just to add to that as well, because I don't want to make it sound like there are only 11 actions in India around net zero. That's obviously absurd to suggest that. So the other point I'm making more broadly is around engagement, because I just don't think we're seeing it through our current mechanism of engagement, which have this kind of global north bias attached to them, because of obviously the language that they're articulated in, just to mention kind of one example. So I think that we need to do more to kind of translate this like more broadly than just the language sense in terms of a way that is going to resonate properly across these regions. So just to kind of finalize on that point.
Good. Thank you very much for clarifying that. Miles, we have another question. And how should investors treat non-energy polluters like cement producers?
Sure. I mean, carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide, whether it comes from energy or cement. So I say exactly the same questions need to be raised with a cement producer. You know, do they have a plan for transitioning to a different product which doesn't generate carbon dioxide in its production? Or if they don't, do they have plans to capture CO2 at the point of generation and bury it? And by the way, the cement industry has a real opportunity in this, in that you can make carbon negative cement relatively easily, as I understand. I'm not a specialist in this, but as I understand it, if you capture the CO2 that is generated at the cement plant and re-inject it underground or get rid of it in some way where it doesn't end up in the atmosphere, then you end up with a product that in using it, it actually absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere. So, you know, one could imagine a future in which our cement producers are actually being paid by other people for absorbing their CO2. That's quite an interesting scenario, given that sort of cement producers at the moment are seen as a big part of the problem. They could become a big part of the solution. And that's where I think investors can really encourage big cement producers to see an opportunity here. I mean, as Mark Carney pointed out, there are huge business opportunities here. And the company that gets ahead of this and is selling, you know, net zero compliant cement is going to have a huge advantage. Even if their cement is a bit more expensive, you know, the cost of the cement is generally not the main cost in building a building. And people who are building buildings will want to be able to say, you know, our building is carbon neutral. They're going to want to be able to see a carbon neutral stamp on the cement bags coming into their building site. And so it may well be an advantage, a competitive advantage, to be selling, you know, more expensive cement, but cement which is consistent with the net zero world. And that's where cement, you know, that's the conversation I think investors should be having with their with the companies they own if they're in these high carbon industries.
Thank you. Matt, I don't know if you have something to add on to that. You would mute.
I think that's very, very well covered. Sorry, that's what I was going to say.
Perfect, that's fine. No, we can't also talk about this without talking about, you know, legal liabilities and all of that, Miles. Now, we know that, you know, there's been quite a number of climate legal cases going on in at least 28 countries, right? Can you, and also, you work with attribution signs and, being able to also quantify the emissions by some of the top global emitters. Can you please talk to us a little bit about, what you've done in that space and sort of the legal cases that are coming up and what people should be aware of from a legal perspective?
Well, just briefly, it's increasingly possible and indeed increasingly routine to actually quantify the harm done by past emissions. So for a long time, people thought that just wasn't possible at all. It's now moved from being not just possible, but it's done all the time. And I think that does open this issue of liability. I'd be actually interested in Matthew's take on this, on how the loss and damage discussions are featuring in these conversations in the UNFCCC. I think there are multiple sides to it. I mean, some people are very worried about these conversations, that they might just result in everybody becoming very defensive, and it sort of degenerates into name calling rather than actually constructive plans for the future. And I clearly recognize that's a danger. I'm not sort of advocating for more court cases. I think there's I think these cases have a role. They're clearly. I say I'm not advocating for more court cases just for the sake of more court cases. I think we need to look at the case and look at the big picture of what these are achieving. But I think it is important that there is a risk in just continuing with business as usual. And that risk goes beyond just a bad reputation. So I think that's something that both investors and companies need to acknowledge. But from UNFCCC's perspective and loss and damage and so on here, what are your thoughts on this, Matthew?
No, I mean, look, it's a complicated issue, and thank you for putting me on the spot there, Mars. But I would just probably just echo you on this point specifically, just to say it has served a purpose, if only to shine a spotlight on these issues and kind of raise it in the column inches of the press and on obviously our broadcast streams. So I think there has been some kind of positive momentum that's derived from it. How that will then interplay within the negotiations is difficult to kind of predict, but it definitely has heightened the profile.
And I would just add, when I say has served a purpose, I don't mean that I think it's over. I think these cases are going to continue, and in fact they're going to increase. It's inevitable.
Fantastic, thank you. We're nearing the end. There's quite a number of questions also coming in, and I'm also receiving some email and WhatsApp. Those who have my numbers. We're sort of wrapping up, and I'm going to be asking Miles to sort of give us his last few words, and Matthew as well. And we will make this video available on YouTube as well if you want to watch the video again. But before Miles would wrap up, I just want us to sort of touch on this again for people to understand that Miles, is the ambition physically possible, the climate ambition, the 1.5 degrees, is that target really physically possible? I know we've spoken a lot about this, but if we can just touch on this again, is it really physically possible? And what we really have to do, and probably Matt, you can also add on where you can before we go into our last words. Yeah.
Well, actually, that's probably a pretty good topic to conclude on. It is absolutely physically possible. As I said right at the outset, it's finance that commits us to future warming, not physics. But of course, we have the energy infrastructure, the industrial infrastructure, the transport infrastructure of today is already built, and simply scrapping the lot is not possible. We've seen the trauma in COVID-19 that's associated with big changes in the way we live and work that have resulted in a reduction in emissions by several percent. I don't think we know exactly how much yet. But the idea that we will solve climate change by some kind of giant lockdown, I think is completely ridiculous. And although some people are sort of suggesting that oh, well, the silver lining is bringing down emissions, I think that's very unhelpful rhetoric. And it sends a very bad message to people, because what we need to be doing is not, demonizing the past and switching everything off, but investing in the future. And that's why investors have such a big role to play here. Investors think automatically it's your job about the future. That's what investing means. And we need investors to start imagining the second half of this century, because the money you're investing now will still be working for the pensioners that you are investing on behalf of, for the sovereign wealth funds that you may be looking after, will still be working in the second half of this century, needs to be still delivering a profit at a time when I sincerely hope global warming will be history. So let's look forward to that time and think about creating that world.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miles. Matt?
Really just riffing very quickly off Miles, because I agree that we can't pin our hopes and see the opportunity in the kind of 5% or so emissions decrease because of the lockdown. But what I think COVID has reminded us of is just how vulnerable we are as a society to shocks, and how interconnected our society is when those shocks do occur. So I think there's just an imperative that's really come through all of this, which is a reminder that we do need to wake up and emerge from this and bounce back in the way that obviously we've all been talking about. And that does mean this net zero credible pathway that we need to get on as swiftly as possible.
Fantastic. Miles, one more thing. With Matt mentioning COVID-19, you haven't talked much about COVID-19. What are your thoughts on it? I mean, briefly before we end this, what are your thoughts on COVID-19? There's been a lot of news about it. And it has really brought climate change back into the focus to show us how important it is for us. What are your last thoughts here?
I think there've been some encouraging things. It shows what people can do when we work together, and it shows the willingness of many people to work together to solve big global problems, and that willingness is going to be essential if we're going to solve the climate problem. But I think actually, I keep stressing to people, I don't see that many analogies between COVID-19 and climate change. They are very, very different problems. We solve COVID-19 by not doing a lot of things, largely. We will eventually solve it, of course, by doing something, developing a vaccine. But mostly we control this problem by not doing things. I think we will solve climate change by doing things differently. And that's so we need to look forward to that and make sure that investors in particular are thinking about how they can create the world where all of that is possible.
Thank you. I can keep you gentlemen here for a whole day. There's so much to ask and so much to discuss, but we are constrained by time. And I know that the viewers are also, have other things to get to, but the video will be made available, and hopefully sometime we can continue these conversations that we're having. I know that there's going to be the Net Zero Homeschool that Professor Miles Allen is working on as well. Please do visit the website. Miles, what's the title of the website again?
Oh yeah, thanks for mentioning that. So if you go to just netzeroclimate.org, you can sign up to a net zero homeschool that we're running next week to mark the first anniversary of the UK's net zero commitment. And you and your kids, if you've got school strikers among your kids, get them signed up as well. It's targeted at everybody from the well-informed school striker up. And having met many of these well-informed school strikers, I think they're probably better informed than many of their parents on this. So it'll be a real opportunity for us all to take the net zero conversation on together. And we're going to need, as Jacinda Ardern kept saying during the COVID crisis, she needed her team of 5 million New Zealanders to work together. So on climate, we're going to need a team of 8 billion to work together to solve this problem. And this is us doing our bit to try and pull that team together.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And you also have a button for questions on the website. So if any of you have questions ahead of time, please go on the website for the homeschool, submit your questions ahead of time, and then they will review it and try to answer it as much as possible. I know that I'll be joining with my niece, and it's not only focused on the UK, there's going to be speakers from Africa as well. So please get involved in the conversation. It is absolutely important for African countries to be more proactive about climate change than we are. Let's
Indeed,
get ahead of the
Pauline Anneman, from who Rachel introduced me to from the Africa Centre for Energy Policy, is joining us in one of the sessions. Actually, I'm really looking forward to her contribution.
Yes, Pauline is going to join, and she's going to represent all of us and ask, ask some of the tough questions or answer some of the tough questions that we all want to answer. For example, are these targets really feasible for African countries? What can we do? But the main goal of this is we need to get ahead of the conversations. We need to put ourselves in it so that we can help to make the right decisions. We cannot wait for decisions to be made before we come to the table. This is the opportunity for Africa to get ahead of it. And in fact, this whole conference has been about that as well, is to bring in the climate conversation to the forefront in Africa, to the financial services and many different sectors, to keep people informed and to get us engaged, to start thinking about what we can do. Accountability is very important. The Climate Ambition Alliance is also there. They have their website, as Matt has mentioned. Matt, you want to mention the website details again?
Yes, and it's unfccc.int, INT, and then if you go under climate action, there's a whole Race to Zero section, and then we can go through the process that I mentioned to try and get engaged.
Fantastic. Please send Matt all the questions that you have as well. If you send me as well, I will forward the questions on to Matt. But I thank you all very much for engaging with us today. We've had some fantastic conversations, and I'm really pleased with all the engagements that we've received. Our next webinar is on tools for managing climate risk, and that ends our 14 series of webinars that started from the 2nd of June and is ending today on the 19th of June. It's been a fantastic and an amazing opportunity to share the space with you all. The moderator is going to be Professor Matt Ives, who is from the University of Oxford and part of the Post-Carbon Initiative. We're also going to have S&P Trucost, which is part of S&P, who's going to be also presenting. We'll also have Alice Insights, a number of companies to show you, what tools can be used, because we've come here, we've talked to you about the science, we've shared with you what can be done. Now we have to leave you with tools to say, what can you use internally to assess your portfolios and everything. So I thank you all very much. I encourage you to join us this afternoon again. And without much ado, I say bye-bye.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.